It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the MF CASR lunch today, featuring Jan-Olav Henriksen. I guess we all know Jan-Olav, don't we? So we're on Zoom today, and there is no meeting in the library, and this is necessary at times. We're in a pandemic, and it's just how it is. So, and I suppose we're just like comfortable with its format now, and we're ready to move ahead. So Jan-Olav will present his latest book, or it's in fact, as far as I can see, a forthcoming book, which is supposed to be out in February 2022. And the title of the book is Climate Change and the Symbolic Deficit in the Christian Tradition, Expanding Gendered Sources. I'm really eager to hear about this, Jan-Olav. If you have questions for Jan-Olav, please use the chat function, and Esther will monitor the chat. So we're getting ready for like a 13 minutes presentation and then a 13 minutes Q&A after that. Please, the floor is yours, Jan-Olav.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for having me in this week, where there are some very important things happening just across the Nordic Sea in Glasgow, and what an apt date for presenting this book. As you know, I'm a systematic theologian, and I think that the main task of systematic or contemporary theology is to try to deal with contemporary problems in light of the resources we have available in the Christian tradition. So that's the basic backdrop to why I did this book. However, in light of what we know about the Christian tradition, and in light of the contemporary crisis with regard to climate, we have to recognize that there is a deficit in the resources that we have in the Christian tradition for dealing with this, because there are actually not many resources at all available for dealing with climate crisis in the amount or to the extent that we are now facing it on a global scale. So what I'm trying to do is to develop what I call practice symbols that could help us to understand all of our actions in light of this crisis. In the book, I do that by dividing the book into three main parts. First of all, I present, before the three parts, I present the deficit thesis, which I already kind of briefly mentioned, that there is a deficit in this tradition. That means that we have to expand the sources, and the sources I mainly develop in order to do that are gendered sources, that is, sources that are allowing us to dig deeper into how experiences related to having a child or bearing a child might be also a way to understand how we relate to the future, because to bear a child under your heart is a main experience that's also relevant for far more than for mothers, actual mothers. It's relevant for all of humanity, and that's what I do in the main third part of this work. However, before that, I, in the first part, discuss how things have changed in terms of seeing things that happen in nature earlier as acts of God, to now seeing most of what happens in nature as something that is caused by humans. That is the situation of the Anthropocene. Then I discuss some of the culprits for the contemporary predicament. And I discuss then especially Lynn White, who has accused the Christian tradition of being the main culprit for the situation in which we find ourselves. He then blames a religious tradition, whereas on the other hand, and I come to that discussion of Lynn White with a discussion of Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectics of the Enlightenment, which addresses the culprit totally different. They see the crisis as the result of modernity's eagerness to control everything, including nature, including the others, including women, and so on. Furthermore, in order to expand the context of the discussion, I discuss what I call consumer idolatry, which is basically the society in which one relies on and puts one's trust in a consumer society. In the West, a society in which we have based our trust in oil and consumption more than in other values. And I use notions which also entails that I'm calling out this consumer society as based on a heresy. In chapter 4, though, I discuss also critically by means of bringing up Robin Wellman's nice study on climate change deniers. I discussed the problem with religion itself being in denial about climate change. And then in the last chapter of the first part, I discussed the need to empower those who suffer and the need for giving a voice to those who lack a voice, including those species in nature that we are not able to listen to as we listen to humans. So with all of these different parts of the first part, I hope to establish a kind of context for my discussion. Then in the second part, which is not as large, well, it's large enough, it's 60 pages also, but the book is altogether 280. In the second part, I discuss conditions for what I call symbolic practices, practices in which we all need to be involved. And the first of these chapters discuss then symbols as ways of mediating practice. And I draw on a lot of different theories about symbols in that chapter. Then in the next chapter in that, in the next chapter in part 2, I discuss the conditions for agency based on what we know about symbols. And here I bring about a critique of modernity's detached subject. This is a chapter in which I discuss the ideals we have about detachment, about being objective and so on. And I argue that we need to overcome that in order to also overcome the anthropocentric conditions for agency, which we find in also very much a modern philosophy. One of the things I also argue there is that we need to have not only an emotional, but also a sensual experience of nature as something that can help us to understand the ways in which we are interwoven with nature and how we need to practice our agency within the context of the global as a whole. In chapter 8, I discuss symbols that could enhance moral motivation. And there's a couple of things that I do in that chapter, which I think is interesting to discuss also with you probably. On the one hand, I discuss the question about whether we should use a stick or a carrot in order to provide the means for moral motivation. And I do prefer the carrot way of doing it, and I discuss moral philosophy that might help us in doing that. And here I bring into the perspective also questions about I bring into the question about I bring into the perspective question about virtue ethics as the kind of basis for that kind of morality. I also, based on the virtue ethics of, for instance, Linda Zagrebski, argue that we need moral heroes. But unlike Linda Zagrebski, who points to those ideals which we hardly can live up to, any one of us, I suggest that we approach what I call everyday heroes, those who we could admire in some of what they try to do in order to help the environment. But virtue ethics will be an important element in that, and also in the latter parts of that book. Another thing that I do in this chapter and also in the following is that I try to distinguish between positive and negative symbols. Positive symbols, which we find in the religious tradition and also elsewhere, they can only help us in identifying what is wrong. Sorry, did I say positive symbols? I meant negative symbols. Negative symbols identify what is wrong. And if you want some examples of that, you could, for instance, use the notion of sin as a symbol that points to the human condition. Or you could have another image like the notion of hell. Those are negative symbols. They tell us something is wrong, something we should avoid, and so on and so forth, but they do not inform us about what it is important to do positively. So what I try to restrict myself from doing in the book as a whole is to point too much towards the negative symbols, because I think the positive symbols are those that fit best with what I call the carrot way of motivation. And this is where also the image which I use throughout about bearing a child under your heart is a kind of positive symbol for the same kind of attitude towards the future, towards nature, towards that which is close to us, towards that which we are intertwined with, and so on and so on. I close that part with what I call an inductive, experientially oriented theology reflection, which means that in order to establish the basis for all these symbols that I engage here, we need to relate theology and experience closer together, and we need to do it in a way that do not start with theological propositions as such, but starts with experience. So in in part 3, which is the main bulk of the book, I discuss different types of symbols. I discuss God as creator and how that could be a critical symbol. And one of the main things there is to try to show how God and the world are intertwined in a way that does not allow for us to understand anymore God as someone detached from or seen apart from the world. I discuss also how creation entails that we are interconnected deep down with the rest of creation, and how that entails responsibility. And responsibility becomes the main topic in the book as a whole. Against that backdrop of opening up the discussion of responsibility, I discuss the notion of stewardship, which has been used and also highly criticized in much of the literature, because it suggests that humans are in control, that we could steward everything by means of our actions. And I think that's something that restricts the perspective that we need to have. In order to develop that further, I discuss then a need to expand the conception of human agency from something that has to do with humans only to all of creation. And in that chapter 11, I develop the notion of creation's future under your heart, which is the fundamental metaphor that I'm using. When you are pregnant, you have some of creation's future under your heart. And this is something that I develop in the relationship to two important thinkers, not theologians, any of them, but very closely related to theology. That is Hans Jonas, who speaks about our responsibility for future generations and for all of creation, and also Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt's notion of natality is one that I bring in connection with Hans Jonas. Then I discuss some symbolic deficits in apocalypticism and argue for a more presentist eschatology, more constructively, in order to do develop some symbolic practices. I discusses the negative symbol of sin, and then I move on to in the last two chapters to talk about caring relationships, in which I discuss a lot of different relationships seen from the point of view of being entangled with the whole world and not only with our own species. And the last chapter, and I know that I know on the last minute, yeah, is about sacrifice, hope, and grace, where I discuss, for instance, the need for us to sacrifice something. And in order to develop a productive understanding of sacrifice, I, among others, discuss Sarah Coakley's understanding of sacrifice, which she has developed in relationship to motherhood. So the overall thing is that I have kind of tried to, from a male perspective, understand how the experience of motherhood and being closely connected to the future are something that is informing for all of us as humans when we face this global crisis in which we now find ourselves. So thank you very much for listening.